glad to be here. Actually, I came, this trip to India was really just to see how things were on the ground, because if you follow from afar, you don't really get a very good sense of how people are reacting, what people are saying beyond the headlines. And for me, and I'm sorry if what I'm going to talk about might be quite familiar to some of you, but I hope we can still have a good discussion. So I think for Pankaj, this really has more to do, as he will say, with the relationship between narrative in literature and in history. Whereas if I could just say what this is for me, a few years ago, as you know, I work both on contemporary or modern literature as well as early modern, and I was talking about Persian versions of another Prem Katha, another romance in JNU, the School of Indian Languages, and one student asked, "Madam, iski kya prasangikta hai? No, why should we be at all interested in this?" And I think this had partly to do with the fact that there was a department of Hindi and Urdu. Why was I talking about a Persian text? But also the sense, I think, in Hindi, and I don't know how many of you are students of Hindi literature, that literary history is kind of done. No? It's been written, it's been settled. There are sthapnae, as they said, and basically, if anything, your work is to add to the sthapnae. And it's not prasangik anymore. And I think, of course, there's a way, as Sunil was saying, that, or we were talking about when we were having lunch, that, you go and talk about literature and history and so on in times like this. But I think, and this has been the reason, in fact, why I did this whole project on early modern literary history, taking Pura but North India as a whole, from a multilingual perspective, was really to try and say, actually, it's quite prasangik, the way in which we understand the history of Hindi, we understand what Hindi and who languages belong to and they don't belong to, and a certain very settled, very ingrained understanding of language, literature, community, script, traditions, and so on. So I hope, for me, this today is in a way an opportunity to open this up again and see actually how we do literary history has a lot to do, how we think about literary history has a lot to do with the present, and if we want to change the present, we also have to change our literary history. Kind of that's my basic point. More specifically, how the new, as you know, early modern or even second millennium history has changed a lot, in the last 20 years or so. But I don't think we've really thought about in Hindi about how the new kinds of, Sultanate, early modern history, but also music history, art and architecture, history of emotions, cultural exchanges, how this all, how does this change our view of Hindi? Can we still really think of, Virgata Kal and then Bhakti Kal and then Dhriti Kal in this kind of very steady way? Or do we have to engage? Or in fact, we can very, very, very usefully draw upon the recent historiography to make literary history prasangik again. So, and for me, as some of you may know, for me, it's been the idea that you may in fact work on a single language, on a text written in a single language, but you cannot really be any longer unaware of the fact that there were other languages around, that people were more, as Purushottam Agrawal has this wonderful word, bahushrut, that in fact even before you start learning your kakagha, you already have, probably your, some version of Persian in your mind, some version of, Rajbhasha in your mind, some version of, other languages in your mind. So it's not you've got the cultivation through both oral and written kind of, but you also have access. And so, you know, you may be your Tulsidas, you know, who's writing, no, in fact, but even Tulsidas, you know, is very, in a way, is multilingual, no, with Sanskrit and Awadhi and Brajbhasha, no? So what does it mean? People just say, oh yes, he is, but what does it mean? What does it mean that Persian must have been somewhere in his, you know, in his environment? And so for me, working multilingually has been thinking about multilingualism as inherent in people, no? So in your body, kantast, really in your the kind of taste that you have access to, and spaces, so that even if you seem very monolingual, if the space around you is multilingual, you know, you have to engage with that in some way. And I think, again, maybe, and I think we can make it as part of our discussion, so these are all preliminary thoughts, you know, how, as we know, you know, I mean, as I was doing my PhD in Hindi, you know, I could see a certain pattern of research being done in Hindi that repeated itself largely, no? So again, how can we come together, literature people and historians, to renew a kind of culture of research in Hindi, culture of historical research in Hindi, with new sources, new questions, and broader context. And I just want to use Padmāvat as an example of this. So, as you know, the oldest version of the Padmāvati story is, in fact, the sumptuous, accomplished, you know, large Prem-katha, as it calls itself, romance, by Malik Muhammad Jayasi, written in 1540, that combines a love quest of Prince Ratan Kumar for Princess Padmāvati with a martial narrative, the second part, where Sultan Alauddin has his eye on Padmāvati and in the end takes over Chittor. Now, so Padmāvat, written in the Qasba of Jais, is a wonderful, rich and dense work that uses a already common vernacular Chopai Doha stanza that was used for most verse tales, and embellishes with certain set pieces, with dialogues, and with a very dense web of metaphors that encodes both the quest and the martial narrative in a way that you can listen to it as a wonderful tale, or you can listen to it for deeper meanings. Jayasi, Padmāvat was well known and admired in India in the early modern period and circulated in different scripts, Persian, Kheti, Nagari, and was kind of retold or translated in ways that actually acknowledge that Jayasi was the author in Persian, in Bangla, and later in Urdu till the 19th century. In fact, Bhartendu had a copy in his family library. But although an early 17th century Persian editor of the text, slightly west in Amroha, called him the chief of poets, the Malik al-Shuara, only, in fact, a Sufi-oriented local history of Jayas features him, and in fact praises him as a poet and as a disciple of a local Sufi, Mubarak Bodle. And as you can see, equates, gives a sort of Sufi reading of his works, and equates his work with the most important books on Gnosis and Sufism. So if you follow this author, then you would think that that Jayasi has written a tale that encodes all these meanings. And in fact, this is also a text that connects Jayasi to the local Raja of Amethi. And there's a story about, how, an anecdote, in this history about how he went to the court and was sent off by the fanatic Brahmins, and then threatened to curse the Raja, who then came running after Jayasi. And you could think, okay, this is one of those stories, but actually the tomb of Jayasi is in Amity. It's just a short distance from the palace of the current Raja. I don't know if the palace before was there, but and the point, and the text also, as I say, proposes a specific Sufi key to the Padmāvat. So he says the Sat Deep Navkanda are the 9 ways and 7 lights of the Ashrafi path, as written in the Maktubat-e-Ashrafiyya. And the author of the Padmāvat has written the detail of these letters in the Padmāvat and has called the Maqam Sat Deep Navkanda. So that's one way of reading it. He also tells us that the people who loved Jayasi's poetry were famous Sufis of the regions, like Abdurrazak Bansavi and Mir Said Ismail Bilgrami, and so on and so forth. Yet, and that's my first question, is then why is Jayasi absent from any tazkira of either Sufi or Persian poet? We see that somebody does acknowledge him as a poet, but why is he not there? Jayasi puzzled modern historians too. Sorry, let me just maybe go back to. Why would a Sufi poet, a Muslim, write in Hindi or Awadhi and favor Rajput heroes over the Delhi Sultan? So for George Grierson, who edited the text in 1896 with Sudhakar Dwivedi, and in fact this is one of the few volumes of Bibliotheca Indica series devoted to a non-Sanskrit or non-Persian text. So Grierson called Jayasi's Padmāvat as a conspicuous and almost solitary example of what the Hindu mind can do when freed from the trammels of literary and religious customs. And I'm still puzzled by this. Mal Muhammad Jayasi is not a Hindu mind, but you can see what contortions one has to start entertain if one wants to try and explain why the Padmāvat in this way, if you already have certain ideas of, what the Hindu mind is, what Hindi is, and so on and so forth. So in other words, Jayasi had transcended his Muslim self to write a Hindu romance. In the greatest Indian Hindi literary historian, Ramchandra Shukla, praised Jayasi because, like other Sufi poets of Awadhi romances, and he started a new term, Premakyan, as a kind of calque of romance. Though a Muslim, he told Hindu stories in the speech of Hindus and with full empathy. He set his liberal heart in perfect tune with the touching realities of their lives, and strove to remove any estrangement between Hindu and Muslim hearts by laying them simply before one another. Sorry, I haven't got the Hindi original here, but many of you will be familiar with this passage. Again, we've got warm praise, and in fact, Ramchandra Shukla edited a Jayasi Grantavali, so he was, an admirer of Jayasi. But underlying this warm praise, you've got these strong assumptions about language, authorial intention. Also, if you're a Muslim, a Sufi, you're writing in Hindi, why are you doing it? Well, it must be because you have a liberal heart. It must be, there's a strong intentionality behind it. Again, what Purushottam Agrawal has called birth determinism. You're Jayasi, then that's what you must be thinking. So this birth determinism held that a Muslim born poet in Hindi must be choosing this language, entailed with some specific motivation, like that of overcoming religious fault lines and promoting social harmony, because Hindi and a Hindu tale naturally belong to the Hindus. And I think you can start hearing the echoes with today. I don't think this understanding of language, community has changed since either Grierson or Ramchandra Shukla. Now, the questions I think that arise from the fact that we know, let me just sorry, I have the slides are a little bit here and there, but, sorry, I'll come back to this in a moment, but this is a manuscript history of Jayas. You can see Persian script, Kheti, Nagari, and so on. Sorry, the pictures are not showing. Okay, never mind. Okay. And you can see that it was translated quite a few times, many more times, or retold many more times compared to some of the other Hindavi romances. So the question arising from this extensive circulation, but patchy recognition of Jayasi and his Padmāvat and the other Katha, and from the friction in modern literary histories between the language and content and the author's religious identity. And this to me highlights the fact that in order to properly see this work, to account for its power, for its existence, for the significance, we really need to change completely the ethno-linguistic categories that align script, language, community, and nation, and ignore the multilingualism, as I say, inherent in people, places, and texts. And I think that in order to properly appreciate the Penkathas as a genre, we need to open up the Hindi literary canon and rewrite the history underpinning it. And I'll try and do something very, very brief and very simple in the time I have. So just to tell you a little bit more about, so I call my approach located and multilingual, and I'm interested in the ways in which people and literature operate ordinarily, so the ordinary life of literature across languages. And this approach, going beyond the diglossia in the sense that it recognizes the hierarchies between languages, the fact that certain languages are valued more, you spend more time learning them, other ones you don't think that you even need to write a grammar of them because they don't have a grammar, or you're not interested in that. So the hierarchies are there, but also the fact that languages have aesthetics and affective power, texts have aesthetic and affective power, that often works at tension with the ideas of hierarchy. I think we are all familiar with people who bash Muslims and love Urdu poetry. I think this is a very good simple example of that. And that's an interesting contradiction or sort of construct, I suppose. But so the kind of comparative literature that comes out of this looking at how literature works in multilingual context is one, I call it from the ground up. So typically literary history focuses only on one language. You have Hindi literature, Urdu literature, Persian literature, and so on, Italian literature, and on what people wrote in that language. And primarily, as we know, on the great works or on literary innovations. This regularly makes what they also spoke, sang, read, or studied in other languages, drop out of the picture, drop out of focus. So instead, this kind of comparative literary history, multilingual from the ground up, focuses on literary practices, what people do, what you as an individual, what I as an individual, what are my literary practices? What do I listen to? What do I read? And in different languages, and thinking that all that, in a way, is gives me some kind of key as to how literature works in the context that I live in. So I focus on the idea that there are multiple communities of taste at the same time, and that people may dip in and out or participate in several. That tastes and stories can be transmitted across languages and communities with or without translation. If I read the Padmāvat in Awadhi, I don't need a translation. I can read it in Awadhi, even as I perhaps work in English for my other, for other tastes and so on. And in fact, this has been an interesting question for certainly literary culture in North India, of how multilingual it is and how few actual translations there are. You would expect more, but there are few. Why? Maybe because they're not, because literary cultivation means that you will read or listen or approach a text in its language. Right, let me think of how Jayasi and Padmāvat fit within this approach. So first of all, I think we can acknowledge that we don't know much about him and about his life, only a little bit of what he tells us, but but that the stories that place him, for example, in relation to local Sufis, to being, having taken initiation, or to the local Raja or chieftain of Amethi, we can interrogate them and what they may tell us about local politics and culture, and the possible, more than one communities of taste that he participated in, and that his text then clearly circulated in this various script. Also interesting is the fact that, for example, in another of his works, he places, and sorry, that was all upside down in the first slide, he places kathas very much in the public space of the town. Mal bhand nat natak nachahi, pandit baithe sastar bachahi, geet nad ras katha, bhala hoi visram. It's a nice pastime, bhala hoi visram. Geet, nad, and ras katha. Gad ke log bhaye sukhi. So often these towns have a guard, and the people of the guard. And dana dehi bhaladam, so they reward you well. Now, register. So people have long acknowledged that Jayasi wrote in pure Awadhi. And then the whole question is, well, does it mean that he knew no Persian? Does it mean, again, he's the good Muslim who writes in Hindi rather than the bad one who writes in Persian, and so on and so forth. But does it mean that he did not knew no Persian? In fact, the Sufi text we've seen places him as a kind of, creator or in a way the translator of all these meanings from Sufi text into a Hindavi tale. Now, if we think of the local Sufi culture as trilingual, so there's some Arabic, Persian as, for kind of risalas, for also poetry and so on, and Hindavi for tales and songs, and dohe, then we can see that, okay, there's no reason why he should, in fact, it's probably quite unlikely that he would not have known Persian, but that his choice of this register for Padmāvat was in fact functional to the genre and functional to the audiences that the text wanted to reach. Yes, so a multilingual paradigm allows us to envisage a scenario in which poets clearly educated and talented like Jayasi had most likely studied Persian and probably some Arabic, but probably also some Sanskrit and Apabhransha, poetics, but produces a vernacular literary idiom that is very sophisticated. So it's not sophisticated in terms of Sanskritic register, like say Alaol in Bengal, but sophisticated in terms of diction. Now, genre, I prefer katha or prem katha to premakyan, the term that is usually used in Hindi literary histories and criticism, because in fact it was, I think, introduced to distinguish the genre of the Sufi romance from the Prabandha Kavya of Hindi authors, so that you have a separate, a separate genre for the Sufi authors. And why instead I use katha or prem katha? Sorry, and I go back. So I'm sorry. There's some nice pictures, and see that in fact, apart from the Sufi ones, I don't know why, you have actually quite a lot of other texts around this time that call themselves katha. And of course, the Ramcharitmanas is a manas katha. So katha as a term and they're all using chopai doha. Some of them are actually quite, they mention all kinds of other texts. So they're very aware of each other. I think I've got one here. Yeah, so this is Padmāvat, sorry, and again, it's in transliteration rather than Hindi, but you can see that he's mentioning Rajkumar and Mirgavati, Manohar and Madhumalti, and even some other ones. So, Sufi and non-Sufi ones, in fact. So, to go back to the Padmāvat again, Hindi V. Penkatha were already established by his time, though his and the other early 16th century kathas like Madhumalti and Mirgavati are considerably longer, they are more sumptuous, Interestingly, I think, sorry, and if I, whereas in Chandayan, for example, royal or elite celebration is a big banquet, a big and detailed banquet with all kinds of types of rice and vegetables and meats and so on. By the time you get to Padmāvat, Mirigavati, Madhumalti, celebrations are a musical and dance, and with great display of knowledge of ragas and so on. So I suppose going back to the question that Pankaj put and Sunil put in the blurb, this is how we read this historically. So we don't really say, oh, what does Padmāvat tells us about what's happening in North India in the 1540? We think, how does a tale code, particularly if we read it sort of historically with what comes before and after, how does it kind of code a particular social milieu, a particular even imagination, and so on. I'm just getting to the end. So, or towards the end, yeah. So apart from Tulsidas, just to come to actually, again, back more to the present. Sorry, these were nice pictures. Maybe I can show you later. Yeah, okay. Sorry, there was a picture there as well. I should have done this better before. So to come back to my question at the beginning, apart from Tulsidas's Ramkatha, which was one of the earliest Hindi texts to be printed despite its big size, and which has remained, of course, as you know, a bestseller and an object and instrument of devotion, Hindavi Prem Kathas, whether Sufi or not, struggled to enter the print market and Hindi literary history. Most of them, in fact, surfaced only after 1900 during the Khoj, the search for Hindi manuscripts undertaken by the Nagari Pracharni Sabha. This is how Khutbans Megavati, Usman Chitravali, Puhakara Rasaratna, and so on came to notice. So almost the whole tradition became visible as a tradition only after 1900. Interestingly, though, the manuscripts often were found in the libraries of local rajas or prominent literati, so like Maharaja of Benares, as I say, or Bhartendu. So they had been physically there all along. And yet they did not form part of the burgeoning Hindi literary consciousness, historical consciousness, which pivoted, if you think of Shiv Singh Saroj, around other genres such as the short Kabita. This is what I call a present absence. The books are there, the physical manuscripts are there, but somehow they don't register to the imagination. They're not read as literature. And in fact, I think even after that, apart from, again, the Manas and the Padmāvat, Kathas have been made strangely peripheral to the narrative of Hindi literary historiography, which has pivoted much more around Bhakti or Riti, courtly traditions. The Hindi literary histories that were informed by the Khoj reports, like the Mishra Bandhu Vinod or Ramchandra Shukla's Hindi Sahitya Ka Itihas, began to insert Hindavi Kathas in the general narrative of Hindi literary history. And in fact, in the 50s and 60s, you have a lot of scholarly editions and studies undertaken by the next generation of great Hindi scholars, like Vasudev Sharan Agrawal and so on. And Agarchan Nahta brought to light the connection with Jain and Rajasthani manuscripts and traditions. But my point is that although you have all these editions and all these texts that are being edited and published, and you have a more complete picture of the tradition, the critical assessment of the genre did not really go beyond generic categories of Sufis versus Indian. You got the Sufi and then you got the Bhartiya. The Sufi is not quite Bhartiya, because particularly if the story is, not a local story, or beyond an appreciation, as we saw with Ramchandra Shukla, of the Sufi poet's love for Hindi and openness to Hindu characters and rituals. So by carving out the separate traditions for Hindavi Sufi, Bhakti, Persian, and Urdu kathas, modern histories, I think, have obscured the interconnected history of the genre. The fact that if you are writing it in Persian or translating it in Persian, you must have read it in some other, in Hindavi or in Bengali. It's We can't think of you only as a Persian work. So a multilingual history of the kata becomes a story of several parallel and overlapping processes. You know what my favorite geographer Doreen Massey calls the multiplicity of stories and trajectories. And these include the development of a trilingual Islamic Sufi culture, Arabic, Persian, and Hindavi, the strong cultivation of vernacular tales and songs among regional sultanate rulers and their administrators, but also rural local chieftains, the parallel emergence of katas about Krishna and Ram in Awadh towns, a shift in the Mughal period towards Persian and towards Brajbhasha poetry, and poetics that produce some courtly Persian masnavis and dastans on the kata topics and Brajbhasha Prabandh katas, and a renewed vernacularization of the genre. If you have Padmāvat in the 19th century, they are more likely to come from Urdu, through Persian from Urdu rather than directly from Jayasi. I think that paying attention to literary practices in these different languages as spaces and communities of taste produces a more heterogeneous sense of historicity as well. That, it's not just that this history of the kata genre is just sultanate and then nothing, then it disappears. It continues, particularly in Purab, up to the 19th century, even when other, fashions become more central. And often, so when new fashions change people's taste, like Brajbhasha Kabitya or Rekhta Urdu poetry, often the older strands and tastes do not disappear, but become more circumscribed. They survive rather than thrive. And as I think, even very briefly, I try to sort of say today, if we pay attention in ways that, go to the a medieval history journal longer essay on social history of the genre for a fuller history. If we start paying attention to the life of the kata, both as new text but as copies of older text in their material form, which script, illustrated, not illustrated, illustrated in what style, where, copied, is Jayasi mentioned as an author, is he not mentioned? Is it what in the retelling, which bits are left out? We start getting through the kata, by following the kata as a genre, actually a sense of cultural shifts, but also continuities of tastes from the 16th century to the early 20th century. So we can, I think, start writing a different history of Hindi as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca, for this fascinating journey across the literary world of Jayasi and across the literary history, particularly of the vernaculars. A very good afternoon to all of you. I'm thankful to the department for having organized this, although as we know and as was pointed out, it's probably a bad timing. But this is the only way we know how to do politics. And this is the thing that we are good at, so we are doing this. That's how I convinced myself and tried to take care of some of the guilt of being stuck in a room in an hour like this. So I'll just straight come to the point. Basically, I have framed my presentation today primarily as one that focuses on the middle word in the title of this workshop, narratives. And the thing that I want to share with you, all of you today, are some research problems that I want to flag and share my own thoughts about how I have tried, sometimes successfully, sometimes otherwise, to ford these problems and what has come out of it. So primarily, when I think of the narrative, two things occur to me, and I'm looking beyond the etymology of narrative for the time being. One is that it seems to have some sort of a storyline, that something happens, and it tells you about that, what happened. It starts somewhere, ends somewhere. And two, which is related to word text, that it is a complex line of story. So it's not simple, it has to be complex, it is told in a complex manner. The word text, for example, as you know, is cognate with textile, it sort of indexes weaving. So there is kind of interweaving as something moves on, as the story unfolds. Now, when we research language and literature as historical entities, not as linguists would do, for example, as instrumental entities, like how is meaning produced. But when you do it historically, there is a serious issue, and the issue is that it's like standing in the middle of a house of mirrors, because you're reading language in order to write a history of that language in language. So you are using categories of analysis to write a history of those things which have already used categories of analysis in a given format, and you're trying to overcome it. So it's a very, very difficult terrain, and the first thing that I would like to flag is the fact that it requires a very, very gentle touch. Only then you can do history of language as much as history of literature, because literature goes a step further and looks at the weaving of the thread of language. So, having said that, I would say that one of the first challenges that was beautifully mapped by Francesca when she referred to how Grierson thought of Jayasi's apparently Hindu mind, which is that, and this is like standing in the house of mirrors. This is what happens when you stand in the house of mirrors. All you see is yourself. All you see is your own present, your own world as it is presented to you in the given format of the language that you're used to using and not used to questioning. You think you take that language for granted, you don't understand, we don't understand that that language has a history, it has come about. So in other words, what I'm trying to say here is that when we stand here in 21st century and trying to write a history of language or literature, say in 14th or 16th, as in the case of Jayasi, or 17th, one of the challenges that we face is that the categories we are dealing with has traveled very far. We are looking at some dictionary, we are looking at common sense, we are looking at the way in which these words are being used. So, for example, Grierson already assumed he knows what is Hindi, what is Hindu mind. He assumed that since Jayasi was a Muslim, it would have been difficult for him that the cultural world and the religious iconography and the textual resources available for someone to tell a story must be segregated as Hindus and Muslims. He assumed that. He did not bother to research that. There is another very interesting example you can give of Grierson himself, but I would save that for later. For the time being, I want to flag the second question, which is that mapping this distance, fording this distance between past and present, requires us to dig deeper into the philology of a text, philologically look at the text, because that text also suffers from the same problem. So there might be some Griersons living in 15th century trying to write in the way people thought in 15th century about, say, 5th century. So in other words, we are looking at a complex problem where we have to be self-reflexive about the categories of analysis. For example, most of us should know, but we often forget to keep in mind the fact that the word Hindi is a Persian word. Nobody would deny that. Even those who want to purge Hindi of its Persian vocabulary would not deny that the word Hindi was first used in Persian. So, how do we ford that distance? I suggest that one way of doing that is to textually historicize a text, a narrative, a literary composition that we are reading. How do we go about textually? What do I mean by textually historicizing a text? Say, for example, if one is looking at a particular text, I was looking at, for example, Likhnavali in my research. It's a write-up on how to write, how to frame documents, how to write letters, how to frame official communications, how to write a fathanama, how to make a prashasti patra, how to write to one's brother or mother, or to, if you are a king, how to write to a lord, military commander, or if you are a military commander, how do you write to another military commander or to your king, and so on. Now, the first thing that I tried to do was to look at the history of this genre. Now, unfortunately, for writing, there was no history in Sanskrit. This is a Sanskrit text. Now, there comes the multilinguality that Francesca was referring to. So, what do I do? I mean, there are no texts which write about writing, okay, separately. But there were texts which referred to letters. Vishakha Dutt referred to letters. There were texts like Arthashastra, for example, which had a small section in governance about how to frame documents. So I looked at that. I looked at what it prescribed, whether Vidyapati followed any of that, and so on. There were a couple of other texts in Sanskrit which had sections like these, mostly regarding governance. So, you know, if you're one thing that we are thinking about all the time these days is documentation and governance and violence. The relationship had existed earlier also. Documentation had been, as most of us would know, an important part of the way in which state has developed. But my problem was that all of this did not help me understand why would Vidyapati write Likhnavali? Why would he bother to compile a list of letters and documents, all fictional, all of them fictional, and organize them in a certain order? So one of the things I did was to look at Insha tradition in Persian, okay, knowing fully well that Vidyapati probably had no knowledge of Persian. He probably had no idea of the established Persian literary traditions and so on. But I looked at it, and what I came across was astounding. I noticed that Vidyapati organized his text in 4 sections very strictly, which is the first striking thing. When you look at the book, he starts by saying, my book is about writing. It will help aspiring writers. This is in Sanskrit, that I will organize it in 4 sections. The first section is about this, second about this. And then I realized that there was a compendium almost contemporary in Persian, which I consulted, which gave exactly the same directions to the Insha writers. This is how you compose Insha. So I said this might be coincidence. So I looked a little deeper into it. And I went further into it. It said that every letter, when you are writing a communication, official or personal, it must have 2 completely separate kind of section. The first section would be to mark time, to pay obeisance to the local, to Allah, because we're talking about the Persianate Islamic tradition. So to pay obeisance to Allah, to mark time, refer to the local ruler, to whosoever is the ruler at that point of time, and have some decorative adjectives. It should be in high language, high register of the language, and so on. And the second part should be in simple, operative, ready to understand framework. Okay. Now, when I look at Likhnavali, I realize this is exactly how it is composed. So when I was translating it, and I have translated it, hopefully it should be out by next year. When I translated it, the first portion was the one that I found most difficult, because it was labored, it had all kinds of alankaras, it is full of alliteration, jisko Hindi mein anupras kehte hain. So it is full of alliteration and simile and metaphors, and jitne bhi alankar Sanskrit mein hote hain, wo sare usme thuse hue hain jabardasti. And there is, sentences run into 10 printed lines, where there are a dozen adjectives for each king. And that is exactly how the writer of the text in Persian, giving ideas, giving instructions about how to write Insha, had wanted this to happen in Persian. I have no idea how Vidyapati got into this. It is possible that this became part of intellectual common sense across linguistic boundaries, but it does tell us something about those boundaries that Grierson missed here. The common cultural resources, in spite of the divisions that formal educational boundaries probably put in there. We still don't know, I at least don't know how it happened, but it did happen. The fact that you cannot move, you cannot understand medieval literary and linguistic world by just looking at one world of language, because that language itself never looks out. So Vidyapati never talks about, the Persian literary world. He never refers to it. And yet, this is what I came across. So, in other words, it's important to look at the genre and the history of that genre in the language in which the text is there, but also in other languages, to understand where the trajectories might connect. A second thing is look at the history of theme texts on exactly the same theme. For example, if Jayasi is writing about love, or Tulsi is telling you another Ram Katha, there is something new that he must be seeking to do. Otherwise, there's no reason why he should, tell the same story again. And most of the stories were actually using the older templates of stories. So obviously, there was something they wanted to convey. So it's extremely important that we go back into the similar texts on the same themes and try to understand why the person would write such a text, particularly from the perspective of what is it that the person is trying to convey. Now, when I say what is it that the person is trying to convey, what I have in mind is is going beyond what we usually understand as ideology or standard contours of the more fashionable mentality. What I have in mind is a general pool of ideas, because when I think of a text, I think of how the text is probably responding to other texts. Because howsoever we may fancy the idea of originality, when we write something, what we have in mind, what we're going to write, are other texts. That's how we write. When we write a poem, we write in the style of the poems that we have admired, or with reference to the poems that we have admired, but we want to go beyond. But the point of reference will have to be there. If I'm saying something today about the politics that is going on around us, I have some people in mind to whom I'm responding. Even when I try very hard to sound positive, basically I am responding to something. If I am not responding to something, it will be meaningless. It won't actually resonate in your mind with anything that you are already familiar with, and hence fail to produce any meaningful conversation between you and me. So, in other words, if we are trying to understand a text and its world of ideas, it's extremely important to locate that text within the ecology of other texts historically to which that text is responding. So there has to be a reason why, for example, Tulsidas thinks that he must expand on the idea of Lakshman Rekha, which was used only once before him, perhaps, to the best of my knowledge. Or he must have had some idea of why he gets rid of some of the passages about Dasarath's apparent sexual escapades that Valmiki was so fond of describing. There has to be a reason, because he seems to be responding to some of these stories and some of the stories that are lost to us, perhaps, the oral narratives and so on. Similarly, it's extremely important in this context to understand, to pay attention to the imagery, to the iconography that the author is using. I think the best example of this is Aditya Bahal's work on Mrigavati, and also how he related the iconography within Ramcharitmanas, some of it at least, to what had already been described in Amrit Kund 2 centuries earlier. So the iconography again is extremely important. The power of iconography we can realize if we understand the fact that even today, when poets living in places like Delhi and Mumbai write poetry, they are still writing about blue skies and color of jal, something that they have never heard or seen in their lifetime. That's the power of iconography. So iconography is extremely important. If we understand the generic specificity and iconographic necessity of author's world, then we will stop reading them literally. And sometimes, reading stylized tropes literally has led to disastrous results, as we know. Similarly, I think it's very important to pay attention to one aspect which has I think, almost completely left out. There are occasional references in Francesca's work and in Sheldon Pollock's work, but no sustained analysis of, from this perspective, has, to the best of my knowledge, been undertaken of pre-modern textual world, which is the element of aestheticization. When I gave a title to my presentation, one thing that I wanted to foreground was how to read texts politically. And this is one issue on which I think it's extremely important for all of us to think, thinking also about the prasangikta, the relevance of it. When we think about relevance of why should I bother to read what was written 700 years ago, if not for entertainment, but is it just for entertainment? What is the value in terms of its political kind of connotation? How do I read a text politically? And I think one of the ways in which we can read it politically is by is one that I have referred to already, which is to use the text as a conduit to plug into the knowledge formation of the world of that text, because it is only with reference to the world of the woofs and wafts of that textual world that we can understand the world of ideas. This is going beyond the ideological world. I'm saying that what I'm trying to suggest here is that while 3 authors may differ amongst themselves and may have a conversation, for them to have a conversation, meaningful conversation, it is extremely important that they were using same or similar cultural resources. They shared at least some set of values, that this is good and this is bad. What I have called in my book the codes of language, as against the messages that code may be used to be delivered. So that is one way of plugging into the political world of that text. The other way has to do with aestheticization. That is to say, and I think because this might appear a little labored if I try to put it across theoretically, let me give you an example. I was looking at the Vrihad Vaiyakaran Bhusan by Kond Bhatt, 16th century. It's a text on grammar. Okay, so usually you wouldn't expect anything particularly prasangik relevant in this text if you want to read texts politically. But what does it say about words and meanings? Very beautiful, chaste Sanskrit, which kind of creates a resonance in your mind. If you know, in Sanskrit, texts could be composed sometimes in what is called dhanyat matta, that is, it kind of resounds and goes round and round with similar sounding words. So beautifully expressed and very gently framed argument, which is that it says, Kon Bhatt says, that even though earlier, Purva Mimamsa, he is referring to, even though earlier scholars have believed and argued that meaning is original to Sanskrit, and there is some merit in that argument. However, he says that the logic given for this in Purva Mimamsa was that there is stability in the meaning of words. That is to say, for one word there is one meaning, and for a different meaning there is a different word, and there is grammatical and spelling stability. Okay, so second, that it is created, that is to say, it is divinely created. Okay, so it is divinely created, it can't be interfered with. Meaning is intrinsic to Sanskrit. That's the idea. Meaning is intrinsic to Sanskrit. And he goes on to, however, argue that, but if you look carefully, even in Sanskrit, for the same meaning, there can be more than one word. He gives the example of ghat and kalash, and he says that these two words mean the same thing. So he says, basically what he has in mind is an argument given by earlier by people like Dandin and Bhama and later by Kamlakar Bhatt, which said that in vernacular languages, including Apabhransh and Prakrit, if you try to compose something meaningful, it can only be second hand, because meaning was originally created in Sanskrit. Okay, so this is what they held for a long time. Probably what Kond Bhatt is doing is taking note of the fact that much water has and much textual composition has happened between the time of 7th, 8th century when Dandin and Bhama wrote, and now in 17th century when Tulsidas has, 16th century when Tulsidas has already happened, and Keshav Das is about to happen, and a lot has happened already. So what is interesting here is the fact that if you plug into the world of Kond Bhatt, you realize that there was a concerted politics of language itself, where the categories like kavya, for example. Okay, so in Sanskrit there are many words for literature. One of them is kavya, which is the most exalted form of literature. Today in Hindi, kavya has come to stand for poetry or poetic composition, but in Sanskrit it simply meant literature, anything that carried wisdom from kav. So the categorization of kavya, for example, as against more capacious words like vangmay, kavya was exalted form of literary composition. And kavya could be composed in only given languages. So Sanskrit was the language of choice, but you could, if you wanted, also take up Apabhransh and Prakrit. So it is interesting that once you pay attention to it, then you realize why your vernaculars become possible perhaps only, vernacular literary production becomes possible perhaps only after 11th century. Something that we have not yet found any explanation for, ever since Pollock flagged this problem in a somewhat ambitious time frame. But the point is that it is not before Persian challenges this monopoly of our kavya. Persian challenges the monopoly over kavya that was claimed by Sanskrit, although exceptions existed down south. It is not before that you notice the vernacular literature's flourishing. So it's very interesting that the possibility of kavya in vernacular languages was completely ruled out in 7th, 8th, 9th century. By 15th century, Vishwanath Kavi says that yes, it is possible, but in a mixed language, and he kind of has no clear theory over it. Kond Bhatt gives a clear theory over this, but Kamlakar Bhatt back in 17th century, again, after Keshav Das and Tulsidas are passed, he is still saying you cannot have an authentic kavya in any language other than Sanskrit. Okay, so in other words, here is someone who's refusing to take cognizance of what the world that has happened around him, the developments that have taken place, and continue to insist on the purity of kavya tradition. The reason why I wanted to talk about this is because I also want us to understand that beyond the simple aestheticization of a text, there are things that aesthetics, that alankar laden language, there are things that aesthetic seeks to foreground and present as glorious, and there are other things that it denigrates, and yet others that it simply ignores, and that's its own world of linguistic politics. So in other words, as far as the politics of language is concerned, we must also pay attention to the politics of language that has happened in the world of the text that we are seeking to research. So the last point that I would like to make is about the categories of analysis that we use. We often assume that we know what is Hindi, what is Avdi, what is Braj Bhasha, we know what is Sanskrit, and what is Persian, and so on. Especially with regard to language, I think the issue of categories of analysis is particularly important because it appears to anyone who carefully tries to map the medieval world of literary compositions, it appears that a larger number of communication, especially speech practices, existed than what we know of today. This is obvious from the simple fact that whereas we have texts in most of the so-called regional languages, now national languages officially, in India from roughly between 9th to 12th, 13th century, most of these languages come to have they can boast of their own literary composition. But most of these languages are actually unnamed. They are referred either as simply Apabransh, as brushed form of corrupt form of Sanskrit, or they are not named at all, or they are referred as natural tongues. Some word which would be a spin on Prakrit, which literally meant the natural tongue. So it's very interesting that within this ecology, where, say, for example, someone would say Varna Ratnakar, which was composed in 12th, 13th century, was probably the first Maithili text. Some texts they would refer to in 11th century, say probably the first Bengali text, and so on. So you have these references, and you can look at these texts, and they do appear like some form of these languages. But then you look at other such texts about which similar claims have been made, and their grammar is very different, or at least significantly different from the other texts. In other words, when we think of something which has become now an umbrella category, Hindi, जब हम स्कूल में हिंदी पढ़ते हैं तो हमको उसमें ब्रज भाषा, अवधी, प्राकृत, अपभ्रंश सब तरह के टेक्स्ट को जोड़ दिया जाता है और कहा जाता है यही हिंदी का इतिहास है. So we are used to kind of thinking कि हाँ हिंदी में कुछ ऐसा है. So you wonder कि why school children hate Hindi, because in the name of Hindi what they are being taught are a multiplicity of languages whose grammars they are never taught. तो उनको बिहारी पढ़ा देते हैं, हम कबीर पढ़ा देते हैं, रहीम पढ़ा देते हैं, तुलसी के दोहे पढ़ा देते हैं. But one of the things that I want to flag here by way of my last point is the fact that we have to acknowledge the way in which a taxonomy of languages emerged probably sometime between 18th and early 20th centuries, where we started naming words. The grammars were being framed. So even in 13th century, a grammar of Apabransh is sought to be written, but they do not stabilize. They continue to exist in different registers. It is only in 18th and 19th centuries that a more concerted effort to streamline, and I think wonderful works have been done by some people, some scholars sitting in this room, on this process of how the framing, straitjacketing, and naming of these linguistic practices have led to a form of quote-unquote pure language as against the delegitimized forms which fall back on the sides simply because someone decided somewhere that this is the center, the purest core of this language. So I leave you with one question that often I actually in the classroom when I give lectures I start with as a teaser, which is that I ask them, do you know, and I put this to you also, maybe I'll get an answer. Do you know what is the language of our national anthem? What was the language in which it was composed? I mean, in these hyper-nationalist times, it is a real shame if you don't know. I don't. But if someone told me, I would believe them, except that I would say that, yes, but how can you say that this is in Hindi and not in Sanskrit? How can you say that this is in Sanskrit or not in Bengali? Okay. Now, Tagore is an interesting man to think about. as a poet, because Tagore, like many others, there are texts, there are songs of Tulsi and Vidyapati, at least two authors that I know of, about which you would find it very difficult to say whether it is in Hindi or Avdi or in Sanskrit. Okay, so one of the things that I want all of us to think about when we research language is the fact that there are the liminality that we often refer to in terms of the spaces between defined categories. Liminality is actually the rule, perhaps, in the world of languages in medieval times. It is not an exception. Liminality was practiced widely. It is much later that it came to be recognized as liminality. And we can unfortunately access that space today, standing in 21st century, only by using this word liminality, which already assumes two bipolar categories, at least in theory. Thank you so much.